Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Space Madness podcast. This is Jeff Nasanov, and got a couple of interesting guests today and a unique opportunity. I'll introduce them in a moment, but just to introduce the podcast again, I call this podcast Space Madness because space is as far as I've experienced, a uniquely maddening thing to explore and a maddening field to be in, although ultimately extremely rewarding. And as I've said in previous podcasts, I define that differently every time, probably in response to the space news of the week, which this week is especially maddening. So at the risk of going on too long about that, I'd like to introduce our guests. Our guest is Eric Shear, who is a very interesting person. I'll let him introduce himself. And you may have noticed that we have a sign language interpreter. That's because Eric is deaf, and he's asked me to use that language. And so I'm going to. And Justin is our interpreter, who is doing an incredible job. And as I find sign language to be an incredible achievement of humanity and something I can't possibly imagine learning. So when I see it used so fluently, it is absolutely amazing. It reminds me in several ways of the kinds of things that space travel expects of us, that we have to be the best that we can be and cross boundaries and maximize communication and all that. So with all that, Eric, please introduce yourself and tell me how you came to find space as the field you would commit your life to.
Oh, thank you for having me here on your podcast today. I'm a Ph.D. student at the University of Florida, UF, in chemical engineering. And my focus is on new ways to separate solutes in fluids that we can apply to life support technologies in space. So back in 2021 and 2022, I flew on 0G. We had several parabolic flights with Astro Access. There were several other deaf ambassadors with me on those flights. But prior to that, in 2011, I actually flew with NASA on a research flight as I was a community college student at the time. And I was the first deaf person to fly in 0G since the Galludet 11 back in the 1950s.
Thank you for that introduction, and for Justin for telling me how to pronounce Galludet, because that wasn't obvious from the article. Eric has written a remarkable article about this, and I'll include it in the show notes. So, Eric, there's so much in that already. I'd love to know how you got to be on a NASA aircraft as a community college student, and what sort of childhood and early adult experiences motivated you to get there.
So I'll answer the NASA part first. Back in 2011, NASA had a program specifically for community college students. It was called Microgravity University. I think, unfortunately, it's been shut down since then. But this was a way for community college students and their teams to propose their experiments to NASA, and NASA would either approve or deny their request for experiments, and they would put those on a 0G flight. And my team was one of only 20 people who got accepted. And then to get accepted, we actually had to show that our experiments could only be done in 0G. If they could be done with 1G, then you're automatically going to be denied. So we successfully got accepted to that in March of 2011, and after that, everything rolled really quickly. We had to get done building this by June of 2011, and we had to bring our experiment to Houston, down to Ellington Field, and that was June of 2011. And imagine June 2011 in Houston. Come on, that even me, who lives in Florida, like I had to suffer through that for 10 days of heat and humidity. 10 hours a day outside in this just humid, no air conditioned environment, in a hangar, outside, you name it. And we just had water to drink and a fan to keep us cool. We set up the flight, and I did at that time take anti-nausea medication. But as I did, or actually, let me back up. On the ground, I got sick. I got very nauseated, so I took anti-nausea medication. So this was before the flight. I felt my nausea kind of go away, and I felt good before my flight. And then, once we started flying in our parabolas, I realized I didn't have any motion sickness at all. Not even a little bit. And I noticed the 20 other students on the flight, a lot of them were getting motion sick. And I know that almost all of them did take medication. But a lot of them still got sick. So I was like, huh, that's interesting. I didn't. So that really got me thinking. Am I immune to motion sickness? And if so, what does that mean? And I actually didn't even learn about the Galludet 11 until several years later, maybe 2018, 2019. I think that was about when I learned about them.
And just a moment, for our listeners, the Galludet 11 were test subjects in the 1950s, as I understand it, prior to even the Gemini program, studying various. They were put into various scenarios to simulate different types of movement that would normally cause nausea. So that's who we're talking about here.
Right, yeah. And actually, that experiment took place over the span of about 10 years.
Oh.
From the late 50s to 1964.
So it sounds like...
Go ahead.
So it sounds like you went to Houston to do an experiment, but you also ended up being an experiment.
Yeah, you could say that. I never thought of it that way. I mean, I wasn't meant to be an experiment, but yeah,
Sure.
I was.
Well, because you haven't told us what the actual experiment was, which seems to be less interesting than your own experience.
Oh, so you actually want to know what the experiment was? Sure.
I am curious. Again, I'm interested in getting your whole story, not just about your flights, but and after we talk about this, I want to go back to your formative years and all of that stuff. But yes, I am curious what the experiment was, because you did have to compete against presumably a lot of other interesting experiments.
Right. So the experiment itself. So, let me back up. Several months before that, I had an internship at a small aerospace company called Tethers Unlimited.
Oh, okay. A fascinating story. I need to get that guy on an episode.
Right, yeah. And I think the company is shut down currently and has been taken over by another company, I believe.
Yeah, I think so too.
But back then, I was a summer intern at that company working on small rocket engines. And that were running on hydrogen and oxygen that got it from water, split the water, and ran the engines. So the theory was that you would just bring water up as fuel on the rocket for the rocket engines, and then use solar energy to split water into hydrogen and oxygen.
Sure.
And then you boil it in the rocket engine. I know that concept was actually tested in orbit back in 2020.
Oh.
So that was great. That was great to hear. I remember the CEO's personal email, or emailed me personally when that happened. That was a very nice experience. But anyways, So how that relates to my 2011 flight, I got the idea about how to, how do I want to put this? How to detect wetting of the fuel cell membranes. And that it was directly related to the water electrolysis project at Tethered Unlimited, and they really helped us with that.
So it sounds like your specific experiment was on the evaluation of a fuel cell stability in microgravity or performance, and that's what made it unique enough to win.
And I'd say more of performance.
Performance, okay.
The
Okay,
reason I
well,
say that is because currently fuel cells, they require high pressure to work in order to push the fluid, or push it around. So I wanted to look into how well water sticks to that membrane.
sure, in the different gravitational environment of microgravity. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
Exactly.
Well, I'm glad to hear
We
it
did
was
get some good results from that flight.
okay.
We noticed a major difference in how water sticks in 0G. Kind of more bubbles up rather
Is
than
that
spreads out.
is that similar to the property of how surface tension dominates a water droplet in microgravity?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's the surface tension.
Or any liquid. They do. You see them drinking orange juice spheres on the space station. Yeah.
Well, water
Okay.
has a very, very, very high surface tension compared to other liquids that don't have it so high.
Fair.
So you gotta be careful.
Fair enough. Not. Yeah. I was a little too loose there. Orange juice probably close enough, but other liquids certainly have different viscosities and other things. So fair enough. Okay. Well, it's interesting to hear that that was tested. We need all the propulsion alternatives we can get. So, I'm curious if you could go back even further to your childhood or whenever your passion for space really began, and how you started taking deliberate steps to get to that community college.
I do have some memory from my childhood of how I became interested in space. The one thing I remember the most was when I was about 3 years old. My parents had a coffee table book, just full of pictures taken from space, taken from orbit. Most of them were taken from the shuttle, and I think they were all taken by J. Apt, the astronaut.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember opening that book and flipping through the pages on that coffee table book, and I just remember becoming more and more and more fascinated with what I was seeing. Again, I was 3, and so I don't think that was the only thing that got me in there, only thing that started that dream. I know a lot of little kids have a dream of becoming an astronaut, but they give it up. Maybe I just had that dream and never gave it up. I just think it's fascinating, the unknown out there. Right now, I'm a scuba diver. I love scuba diving. And I'll go into these caverns and caves over here in North Florida, and there could be all these caverns in one sinkhole that I'll go into, one cenote. And most people would be scared to go in there. But me, on the other hand, I'm like, I have no fear. I want to do this. This looks fun. This is just natural.
Well, thank you for sharing that. The two separate points about the childhood exposure, really flipping a switch. I mean, I can relate. For me, it was the Griffith Observatory, probably around 3 or 4. And I bounced around, but I came back to that, to space, obviously. And, on the topic of the fear, well, first of all, I would love... my goal this year, the year is half over, but my goal this year is to take the scuba diving courses I know we've discussed. I just need to find a weekend. But it's very interesting that you mentioned the lack of fear in those otherwise terrifying conditions. And I wonder if it. So you've written about how obviously you don't feel certain neurological signals related to balance and connected to hearing. And for me, if I was in a scenario like that underwater, I can only imagine that the feeling of water pressure would contribute to the danger signals my mind is perceiving. I think we talked about this briefly on Messenger. But I wonder if you think, now maybe it's unfair because you have never perceived those from your sense of balance, but it's an interesting thing to raise as we talk about, as you've written about what makes someone suited for space travel.
Like I was saying before, I really don't think the water pressure in ears would really create more of a fear response. Because I do feel the water pressure, but as long as I can equalize the pressure in my ear, I'm fine.
Okay, fair enough. I'm looking for a way to understand how you could be unafraid in a cavern like that. Maybe that's the answer that I'm not going to find, because that seems so terrifying. But
Well, do you get scared in dry caves?
no, but I'm not underwater in them.
Right. So I think it'd be more of the feeling of being underwater in a confined environment is what gets you.
That's true. I do not have the comfort underwater of an experienced scuba diver. So maybe once, if and when I get to the point where it's as familiar as walking, maybe that fear goes away.
Yep. And I've been scuba diving now since 2013.
Okay.
But
Okay.
to be honest, I didn't do a lot for a couple years until 2022 when I started again.
Sure.
And the main reason I had to take that break was I was living in Canada, and there's not very many good places to go scuba diving in Canada. Plus, it's just a little cold.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it wasn't until after I moved to Florida that I started picking it up. I didn't come down here till after COVID, and started flourishing.
Okay. So I'm curious what barriers your deafness put in your way, and how you thought about that and how you manage them, because you've obviously turned it into an advantage in a remarkable way. But I'm sure people listening would love to hear that, and perhaps other deaf people could benefit from that story.
Well, there's a lot of challenges to making and keeping friendships, especially in a public university. I've had to learn different coping skills, different ways to make it work. For classes, for example, at University of Florida, we have recordings of everything. So everything is recorded. So I can videotape and pause and listen and see it. And also the videos usually has captions already set up. So I can easily stop the video, take notes, and my research, I've noticed, has really improved with that. And then going back to the friendship topic, really, I'm mostly really only friends with a couple of people who have accepted me for me. I've learned a long time ago, I can't be friends with everyone. It's impossible. It just is. I'll take what I can get, and appreciate everyone for who they are.
Well, that might be the most positive and inspiring thing I've heard in weeks. You describe challenges in a positive way, almost in a way that's very uncommon, and I think that's wonderful. Not being able to personally relate to that challenge, I find it very inspiring. I notice you didn't mention professional challenges. I'm other than school, I suppose, but I'm just curious how that's played out.
I can say that since I've started my Ph.D. Back in 23, I have a speech to text app that I use on my phone. And most of my coworkers here have one on their phone as well. And to be honest, for the most part, that works very well.
Okay.
So we have a lot of technical jargon here, but the app translates it pretty good. It still has some errors here and there, but we were able to figure it out from context, usually, what those errors are. And the reason why we use the app on our phone is mainly because the interpreters can't always be there. The University of Florida is in North Florida, in a fairly rural area. And there's not many interpreters in this area. So there are other deaf students there as well. So what we have to do is make do with interpreter availability as well as what we have to with technology. So I know that I can't own the interpreters all the time. So the app on the phone is there for when I need it.
Well, that's great. I had no idea they were that good. Now, I have an unrelated
And they've
question.
been getting better and better, to be honest.
Oh, great. Are there any apps that translate sign language visually into speech or to text?
I know there's several companies working on it, and some of them I think are in the prototype stage. But I'm not really sure if it's ready for prime time yet.
Sure. It sounds, particularly with the speed, it sounds like an extreme challenge for machine learning models.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, something to keep track of. So your story is adding up to this very interesting sort of pathway where your research is on life support for human spaceflight. You yourself are an interesting case study of human spaceflight. What does the next 5 years look like for you in your ideal outcome?
Next 5 years, I expect the speech-to-text apps to get even better.
Oh.
To maybe can be complemented with, and maybe what we can do is combine that with the sign language apps that we were talking about and have it be both ways. And maybe what we could do is maybe use it in some sort of like smart glass, so I don't have to look at my phone the whole time.
Sure. I meant more your career in research and all that.
Oh, my career. And my research. Let's see. In the next 5 years, I would like for my experiment to fly in space to detect if we can actually get CO2 scrubbed out of the air at very low energy costs. Because that's the number one problem we have right now in life support technology, is how much energy it costs to remove the unwanted things from our air and water.
So I think we didn't set the stage for your current experiment. Can you take a step back and talk us through that? Sign us through that, forgive me.
can't talk too much about that until I publish.
Understood. Okay. But it sounds like the
Yeah,
challenge you're.
my advisor told me not to tell anyone
Okay.
about any details of my research.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But it sounds like the challenge you're addressing is the high energy cost in gas exchange systems for life support.
Not so much gas exchange as the gas separation.
Okay. Okay. Well, I will leave the questions about your research there for now, but suffice to say, it is one of many research avenues for the development of long-term human spaceflight.
Yes.
Okay.
And believe me, I'm dying to talk about it.
Sure.
But
Well, hey,
my advisor has specifically advised me not to say anything, and he has 40 years of research.
oh, sure.
So,
Well, we'll do another one of these whenever you're ready to talk about it.
okay, that sounds good.
Great. So, suppose it's suppose you've had that test done. You're finished your PhD. What's next? Where do you go with that?
I suspect my research has some sort of commercial applications to it. And we could probably be used in gas separation systems in scuba, for scuba diving,
Oh,
for anesthetic reasons.
oh, interesting.
I mean, honestly, for anything that requires separation of gases.
I see. And okay, at a your advancement being the reduction of the energy costs. Sure, I can see that being extremely useful in all kinds of places. Okay. My exposure to the human spaceflight program at NASA is limited to my own entrepreneurial efforts 10 years ago in trying to get a remote, non contact vital signs system. And in order to introduce that to the human spaceflight program, I worked through, I believe it was CASIS, to try to reach the physicians at the astronaut program. Maybe if you're comfortable talking about it, I'm curious if you or your lab have had any discussions with that office at NASA or anyone else.
Maybe. I know for sure that my research is funded by NASA. I can say that much, so it's
Sure.
possible.
Okay. Okay, I'll leave it there. I'm just trying to imagine the programs that would come after your demonstration and how that would eventually start to potentially be recognized as a solution in the very long list of human spaceflight challenges that NASA publishes. It's pretty daunting if you ever look up the whole list, but we'll figure it out.
Can you rephrase the question?
Oh, it was more of a dark observation of the enormous numbers of challenges ahead of us for actual long-term spaceflight. But
Yep, definitely.
not that we've certainly solved long lists of problems like that in the past. So I'm hopeful, but when you do see the huge list, it's a lot. So I'm trying to think of a way to ask this without asking more about the research itself, but do you see yourself looking for commercial a job at a commercial company when you're done, or to commercialize the technology yourself?
Hmm. think I would try to develop that technology further. I'd rather develop it more before I do anything with it. I think there's some potential for further development that I can't cover in under my Ph.D. So I think I'd like to focus on that.
Okay. That takes us to an interesting subject that may have to be a different call because I don't actually know that much about how you could, other than a postdoc, which may be something you're interested in, how you continue working on a PhD project without commercializing it and moving it out of the university that way. But that's a whole separate conversation about university tech transfer and all of that.
Yeah, I used to work in the University Tech Transfer office.
Oh,
So I have some connections there.
okay. So I have I spent a lot of time dealing with the Caltech Tech Transfer Office about 10 years ago, trying to get them to license a certain radar technology to me. And so I'm sure we could exchange stories there. I don't think the average American has any idea just how much sits behind the wall or the firewall of tech transfer offices at universities funded by taxpayer money, just waiting for a commercialization attempt that could bring it out. That is one of my very long-term interests, is trying to think of ways to unlock some of that.
Yep. My idea with my own possible company is to try to sell some units of my technology, meaning that I can personally produce them and not patent it, just personally produce them. Then use the money to fund further development.
Okay. Well, I would love to help you with that when you get to that point. I also think that
Thank you.
I also
definitely keep
think,
you in the
think
loop.
that I also think that that is a kind of technology that would be very well suited for the enormous amounts of private capital that are flowing around the world looking for a home. One of which was that being a subject of podcast episode 2. But in short, there's inconceivable amounts of money around the world looking for projects and investments and places to live and grow. So I think it's a great time to be thinking about a company like that or some other kind of funding mechanism, especially as our beloved American science organizations are facing serious cuts right now. I'm curious if you could talk about how that has affected your program or your research, and what does that look like from the inside of a university lab, presumably funded heavily by the government?
Yeah, luckily we have not. Sorry. Luckily, we've not faced any cuts so far. None of my colleagues have had any cuts so far. So we've come out luckily. But I did get hit with the tariffs when I tried to order some parts for my experiment from out of the country.
Oh. Can you share I'm just curious, what part, presumably fairly obscure, what part got hit by a tariff?
A motor.
A motor. Okay. So sounds like the kind of thing that the manufacturing of which has moved overseas for cost savings reasons in the past, and that now has a cost increase to bring it back. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to search for a motor in the U.S. And even one made in Europe, but they cost 10 times more than the one made in China, even with the tariff.
Wow.
So it's really, 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 really sad because the motors that we get are from China and they work very well. But we do have to keep in mind that not all of my parts come from China.
Sure.
Most of the parts do come from the U.S. and some from Europe. but some do come from
Yeah.
China and Japan.
Well, and one thing can blow a hole in your budget.
Yep. I mean, and it's not just the motors, but there's several other metallic parts that got huge tariffs. But luckily, my experiment's almost done, so I shouldn't have to
Good.
pay too much for tariffs.
Wow.
And by the way, the motor that I got from China was already in the U.S. being sold through Amazon. So the
Huh.
charges really shouldn't have actually applied to it. They just found different ways around the tariffs.
Wow. Now that sounds like a whole separate podcast episode of people figuring out how to work around that or manipulate that.
Yep.
So you're saying the tariff was applied retroactively to something that was already in the U.S. I just have to ask that because it seems so ridiculous.
Not exactly. What it was is I had to try to buy other parts from American companies that I assumed were made in America, but as I found out, the charges were already applied to those parts.
I see. Okay.
And I just thought it was
Okay.
very strange.
Okay. So the next logical question is the current state of the Artemis program and the American human spaceflight program. I'm curious what you think, being in Florida, where there's a lot of launches happen. Generally, what are your thoughts on where you see things going? I mean, yesterday we had a partial success of the Starship. Everything's in chaos in Washington, obviously. Charting a path for your technology to human spaceflight is a challenge.
Honestly, I've been watching the Artemis program since the origins of the program, and I never had a very good feeling about how that's been going. Because first, the SLS rocket, I know it launched successfully, but it was delayed so much and so over budget. I don't really see a future for it if it keeps going on like this. And I had high hopes for Starship as well, but lately we've had 3 test failures in a row, and it seems they've been caused by the same issue. So I don't really feel very good about SpaceX currently and their ability to solve that issue. And I know Starship is crucial to the Artemis program. So if Starship isn't delivered on time, then I think that'll cause even more of a delay, probably even a cancellation of the program.
Yeah, and all of that's even before we talk about infusing new technologies like yours into subsystems like life support and crew vehicles and so on. Yeah, I any speculation of mine is going to be armchair quarterbacking at best, but it seems like all of 3 Starship failures have to do with the incredible complexity of the fuel system for all of those engines and the challenge of controlling all of those nonlinear outcomes of fuel pressure and flow. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's actually also why the Soviet Union's moon rocket never got off the ground. I think they had a bunch of engines, whereas the Saturn V had 5. Now that is probably way overly simplified, but that's the historical example that comes to mind. I'm sure it will be reported in a completely transparent and thorough public report. So,
Yeah, no.
well, I think we're coming up to the end of our discussion here today. I'm wondering what thoughts you'd like to share kind of in closing, really about any of this stuff or anything else? Could be about scuba diving or microgravity flights or research, or the floor is yours.
I know here at Astro Access we're trying to figure out ways how to fly more disabled people into space, or a parabolic flight, whichever one we can get. And I'm thinking a lot about starting proposals to NASA or some rich person to try to fund us and see if we can have our own space flight. If that works out for Jared Isaacman, then I can't see it wouldn't work out for us.
I really like that, and I will think about that, because I'm built for a different reason. I'm building a list of the sorts of people who could fund such things, and I'd love to see if I can help. Once again, I'm inspired by your perseverance and your effort in all of these different areas. So with that, I think we will close this podcast. Thank you so much, both of you. This was really informative and inspiring. And I think we'll definitely do another episode when you're ready to talk about your research, because that I look forward to hearing about that.
Absolutely. I look forward to it as well.
Great. So this is the Space Madness podcast, signing off, episode 5. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.